Hello, everyone, and welcome to Experiential Spirituality, Episode 10 Launch Day. As ever, you can find me on Twitter and you can ask me anything through Curious Cat via the links below. And as I said on Twitter, there's no prizes for guessing what the subject of this particular episode is going to be because after 3 years, including 2 complete rewrites, my book is finally available via the links below. I got my proof copy of the physical version the other day, and the reason I wanted to see the proof copy first was less to do with the content of the book because I understand how the formatting works and I knew it would appear okay. It was more to do with the cover because I wasn't too sure about certain things. Now, this is a not for resale banner that goes across author copies, but I wasn't sure about certain things. I wanted to make sure that the text on the back of the book showed up well against the background, and the quality of this exceeded my expectations. It's a really beautiful book, and even though on the image previews of the cover, for example, this blue here just looks like a plain blue, it's not. It's actually nicely textured. It just doesn't show up on computers or on your monitor. So I was really happy with this, and again, I'm not really concerned with the aesthetic side of things, but most souls are, and so it's wise for me to pay attention to that because how the book looks is ultimately going to matter, even though what's important, of course, is the content of the book itself. So the first thing I want to do is thank everyone who in whatever way contributed to the book across the last 3 years. Sometimes, for example, I would contact someone on Twitter saying, hey, can you read this section of the book for me just to let me know if it's understandable, because I don't know if anyone's going to understand what I'm saying here. Not because other people are less intelligent than me, I just don't know if my writing is clear enough. And so thank you to everyone who did that. Thank you to everyone who gave me advice in terms of publishing, including Presley Minosity, who I mentioned last week, who also recommended these dried cranberries to me, which are really delicious. Thank you to the one that wrote the blurb. Just all kinds of people have contributed in some way across the last 3 years, including all of you who really kept me going. And I'm sure many of you began to wonder if I was actually writing a book at all. And I don't blame you, because of course there are many souls that constantly talk about a project they're working on, but that project never materializes. So I wouldn't blame any one of you if you'd begun to suspect that this book was simply never going to happen. But I had actually been working on it all this time, and now it's finally out there. So I'm very, very glad of that. And this represents, a major fulfillment for me. It's so strange, having worked on the book so hard for so long, it's strange not having it in my life now. I woke up the other day, same way I have for the last 3 years. I woke up and the first thing I thought was, oh, I've got to get working on the book, because it was the first thing I did every single day for 3 years. I would sleep here, roll off my couch and just get working on the book straight away. But I woke up the other day and I thought, well, it's time to get started on the book. And then I realised, no, the book is finished. It's no longer a part of your life. And that is very strange. So I find myself in a rather strange twilight zone at the current time. And there's going to be further changes to come in my personal life as far as the book is concerned as well, because, for example, my family, as I said, I wasn't raised religious, and my family aren't spiritually orientated at all. No one but me and my family has any interest in spiritual matters. Now, they know that I do, but they don't know anything about it. They don't know the details. And this book, it's not about me at all. The only time I come into the book is when I'm relating my spiritual experiences, but even in that regard, it's very intimate in that way. My family members are going to read this book and they're going to say to themselves, wow, we don't know this guy at all. That's what's going to happen, and this may be my last live stream because they may well have me committed. But yeah, it's going to be strange having people who actually know me read this book and actually finding out what I'm really all about, because of course, not being interested in spiritual matters, they don't ask about it themselves. So, yeah, as I said, the book is available through the links below. I had certain things to change from the last time I talked about it last week. For example, the pricing. When I showed you what I was doing last week, it was $19.99 for the paperback and what was it? $10 I think for the Kindle, but I decided to reduce that by $5. So it's now $14.99 for the paperback and $4.99 for the Kindle. Again, the issue is that you want the book to be as cheap as possible, especially since my priority here is to have as many people read it as possible, because I genuinely believe that it will help people. When I was speaking to those literary agents, I said, look, as far as I'm concerned, this is the most important spiritual work written in 3 decades, and I still stand by that. I think this is a book that needs to be read. So I needed to make it cheap so that people would buy it, but not so cheap that they would view it as disposable. That they would just go, I'll buy this and maybe read it later. So that was a difficult balance to find. And every step of the way, you have to look at your peers and what they're doing, how they're pricing things. So yeah, I decided on the final price. And yeah, it's out there and available, and it's very, very surreal, to be perfectly honest with you. However, it's just freshly released. And so if you go to the links below just now, unfortunately, you don't get to see a preview of the paperback version because it takes a 3 or 4 days to process, which is really unfortunate, because I'm someone that's always preferred physical books because, you can lie down and read them far more easily than you can on a screen and more comfortably. So even though I did my hardest to make sure, I worked with my hardest to make sure that both the Kindle and the paperback version are perfect, because they're not the same thing at all. I mean, in terms of content they are, but you have to format them in different ways and so forth. They're both perfect, but the paperback for me is the real prize. So it's very unfortunate that Amazon takes so long to allow users to look inside the paperback version, because it just looks much better to me than a Kindle ever could, just because of what a Kindle is. Now, I always talk about this book, and I always have talked about this book as if it's the most important thing in the world, but that's not because I lack in self-awareness. I know that putting a book out there into the world is like spitting into an ocean. I know that, but whenever you're engaged in any project on whatever level, I really think it has to be the most important thing ever to you, because if it's not, then you're not going to have the right attitude towards it, and you're going to be rather half-hearted in things that you do with it. I'm aware that this book is going to be a slow burn, which is to say, it's not a book that's going to just become amazingly popular overnight. That's just not going to happen. But it will gradually over time pick up steam. That's what I understand about this book. And of course, having worked on it so hard for 3 years, there is no possible way that I could ever earn enough from the sales of the book to make up for that time. There's just no way. A lot of people, when they start getting into to writing, they seem to have the impression that they can get rich off it. But writing is just about the last thing you want to do if you're interested in making a fortune, because the only souls that live off of writing are souls like J.K. Rowling. And besides that, if your motivation for writing is just to make money, then your writing is going to be tainted, because you're just going to be writing whatever you think is more popular. So whenever someone says to me that they're interested in writing, I always ask them, well, do you actually have something to say, or is this about an ego trip? Is this about you being able to say that you're a published author and things like that? It's very important to have something to say. And so again, the book is available. If you buy it, then please do review it. Doesn't have to be a long review, just any review will help. Even if it's like a comedy Steam review, 11 out of 10 would transcend the material realm. Again, just whatever, but reviews really, really do help. I mentioned looking at your peers in different areas when deciding what to do and how to approach the book. And someone I looked at recently, which seems it's going to seem very strange, but someone I looked at was Brittany Sellner. Now, of course, she she and I have no connection whatsoever. She deals with politics, so nothing related in terms of subject matter, but she is the only other YouTuber I know that recently launched a book herself. And her book on Amazon, I think on the UK Amazon it has maybe 2 reviews, and on the US Amazon it has maybe 6 reviews. And that's not a lot for someone that has tens of thousands of subscribers. And so I think we can beat her forever and ever. We can be heroes just for one day. But I think we can actually beat her in terms of reviews if everyone who buys a copy of the book actually reviews it. And this is not me setting myself up in opposition to Brittany Sellner for some random reason. This is just, again, looking at someone who is a peer and seeing how my approach can be improved by comparison. Because while Brittany Sellner has tens of thousands of YouTube subscribers, I've got a little over 1,000. And so, yes. Have you ever noticed how there seems to be an awful lot of best-selling authors? Like, it seems like every 5th person you come upon on Twitter is a best-selling author. Well, the reason is quite simply that you can be a best-selling author in just about any category. So if 2 best-selling authors meet one another and they say, "Hey, I'm a best-selling author," and the other one says, "Yeah, I'm a best-selling author too." "Oh, what genre are you a best-selling author in?" "Oh, basket weaving," where there's nearly no competition at all. That's why there's so many best-selling authors out there. And I'm very lucky in terms of my own book because it's in some very obscure categories. Categories like Christian mysticism, spiritual mysticism, and so forth. So it wouldn't actually be difficult for me to become a best-selling author and to have my book be a bestseller because there's not much competition in my in those categories. And so that's important in terms of marketing, because if you can refer to your book as a bestseller, then it encourages more people to read it, and therefore more people can benefit from it. And so this is a good example of how you can use marketing thought towards good ends as opposed to a cynical way of just making money. Like the Joker said, it's not about the money, it's about sending a message. Actually, he didn't say that. He said, it's not about money, it's about sending a message. He didn't say the money, he just said money. But I'm very lucky that this book is actually available now, today, because I... there was a bit of I made a risky decision at the last second. So I received this paperback version, and I thought, okay, in terms of quality, it's great. I know the content inside is fine because I've read this book thousands upon thousands of times across the last few years. I know that the content is fine. But one of the reasons I wanted to get this author's copy before I published the book is because reading a physical book is a different experience than reading a book on a monitor, and you can pick up on things while reading a physical book that you wouldn't if you were just reading a book on a monitor. And so first of all, I realised when looking at the table of contents here that what it could really do with is lines, from the chapter to the page number, so that it's more clear to the reader which corresponds to which. So that's the first thing I realised. And I also realised while reading the book, this is not a book you can read quickly. It's quite dense in terms of its content. It's the kind of book you're going to be probably reading sentences again and again to try and understand what I'm saying, just because of the subject matter. And so as I was reading this copy, I thought, what would be really useful here is if each page in a chapter had the number of the chapter at the top of the page, which is pretty standard in a lot of books, because as I was reading it, I realised it would be very easy for the reader to become lost and having scrutinized a paragraph, they might suddenly think to themselves, what chapter am I on again? What section am I on? So I thought, okay, what I'll do before I publish the book is I'll add lines, a dotted line or lots of dotted lines to the table of contents, and I will add the chapter to the top of each page. Fair, that simple as that, really. But that was really asking for trouble, because it was a last second change. And so what happened is this: I made those changes. I changed the table of contents, added the dotted lines to it. I made sure that the chapter was above each page of each chapter. I looked it over briefly, key point briefly, and then I published it. But then I went back to look at the file just one more time. Just my intuition said, David, look at that file one more time. I looked at it, and for some reason that I still do not understand, because it's supposed to be an automated process, I looked at it, and the pages of chapter 3 all said that they belonged to chapter 4 above them. Now, I've always said I'm a perfectionist in my personhood, but at this point I wouldn't have minded if the book had contained the odd typo, because I've never read a book that didn't contain the odd typo. That's just going to happen. But that kind of error, to have the pages of chapter 3 be, say, chapter 4 above them, that was just unacceptable to me. That's not going to happen on my watch at all. The only problem is that when you submit your book for publication, you can't stop it. You have to wait till it's published. And I thought, well, there's no way that anyone is getting a copy of the book with that mistake in it. I mean, it doesn't change anything about the book, but for me, that kind of thing is just unacceptable. But because I couldn't stop the publishing process, and because the process can take up to 72 hours, what I had to do is just sit there waiting for the process to be finished, and then the instant it was finished, unpublish the book and upload the corrected version, which is exactly what I did. But then, of course, I had to wait another 36 to 48 to 72 hours for the correct version to be online. So that's why I'm very lucky that the book is actually available for this live stream, because of that last minute decision to add that one little touch to the book, it nearly undid everything. But I honestly think that everyone is going to be surprised by this book. I was answering a question that someone asked me through Twitter not long ago, and that person said to me, that soul said to me, I shouldn't ask you too much, because then there won't be anything left for the book to reveal. And there's no danger of that happening. The book is over 90,000 words, and I cover just about everything in it. It reminds me of, I don't know how many of you have seen The Princess Bride, but it's a historical fantasy film essentially, but the historical fantasy part of the film is framed within this modern context where a grandfather played by Peter Falk is reading the story to his grandson played by Fred Savage. And at the beginning of the film, Fred Savage says to Peter Falk, does this story have fighting in it or something like that? And Peter Falk says, are you kidding? Fencing, fighting, monsters, revenge, true love. And that's kind of the way I feel whenever someone asks me, does this book have this in it? I was like, yeah, it has that. It has just about everything. So what I thought I'd do in today's episode is go through the chapters of the book and the subheadings of the book and explain exactly why it's written and what it deals with. And by the end, you'll see that even if you're one of the handful of people that have watched me across 15 years, across all my different YouTube channels, this book says something you've never heard before, guaranteed. And so I'm just going to look at this PDF version here. So here's the table of contents in the paperback version, which I wish Amazon would enable their preview of. But we've got the preface, which I'll read after this. So chapter 1, calling. Calling relates to the call to the spiritual journey. That's what that deals with. Awakening, as you might imagine, deals with spiritual awakenings. My method. Now, this is the kind of section that a lot of agents would recommend goes in the introduction, because it essentially explains why I use the terminology that I do. But I've always had the philosophy when it comes to books that, personally, I want everything that needs to be, I want everything to be in the main body of the book. I don't want things to be before the main content of the book or after the main content of the book. That's just my personal inclination, and so that's how I did it. Plausible words, that deals with intellectual argumentation and how it's not a substitute for direct spiritual experience. The way of the mystic, that essentially explains what mystics do, what mysticism is all about. Now, chapter 2, identity, that deals with who we take ourselves to be and how that understanding in the case of most souls is erroneous. Know thyself. Now, that section is a good example of something that I can see happening. Because there are certain things I say in this book and I can just imagine someone not quite reading it properly and then taking me up on something. So at the opening of that Know Thyself section, I mention 3 Delphic maxims. I say there are 3 Delphic maxims, the first of which is Know Thyself. And I can imagine someone reading that and saying, hold on, David, there aren't 3 Delphic maxims, there are 114 Delphic maxims. Which is true, but if you read what I said carefully, I said 3 Delphic maxims inscribed upon a pillar. Yes, there are 114 Delphic maxims, but only 3 on this particular pillar. And that's an example of how you can clarify endlessly. I could go back and edit my book and put in brackets, yes, I know there are 114 Delphic maxims, but sometimes you just go, that's not worth it. This book isn't about the Delphic maxims. I'm only briefly mentioning them. There's no need for me to go to that much trouble. So in any book, there's always going to be something you can clarify further, but in many cases, it's just not worthwhile. And here's something else that was very important to me, is that whenever I've been involved in any kind of business or marketing, I am very concerned with value for money and not being unfair to anyone in retrospect. For example, what is not going to happen with this book? What's not going to happen is that 2 months down the line, I'm going to update the manuscript so that the paperback that is then available is drastically different from the paperback that souls bought initially. Because I think that kind of thing is very unfair to those that bought the book initially. Nor am I going to release a second edition of the book. I'm very keen that the book is the book, and whether you buy it now or in a year's time, the book is the book. Now, if I notice the odd typo here and there across the next few months, of course I'll correct them, but in terms of content, the book is the book and it says what it says. There's not going to be any further elaborations. There's not going to be any second or third editions. The book is the book. See, it's one thing if you're just dealing with the Kindle version, because the Kindle version, whenever I make a change, it automatically updates, or the soul that owns the Kindle version can just download the new version, and that's fine. But of course, there's no way to update a paperback. If someone buys the paperback, then it is what it is, and it's not fair to those that bought the paperback initially to then make these massive improvements that they have to then spend another $14.99 to see. That's just unacceptable to me. So that's not going to happen. The book is what it is and it says what it says. So scrutinizing personhood, well, a lot of these are self-explanatory. The Great I Am, that deals with, in fact, I don't want to spoil anything, conscience and intuition. I'll just stick with revealing what's in the book in terms of what issues I deal with rather than spoiling anything. Chapter 3 deals with the soul, as the chapter title implies. The image of God, this explains the relationship of soul to spirit and how those things relate to God. Essence, that relates to, again, more the nature of spirit and how souls overlook what spirit is because they tend to imagine more grandiose things. Divine focus, that's about the importance of your focus, essentially. It's about not empowering abrasive phenomenon by allowing it to steal your focus. So in that particular section, I give a certain kind of meditation and explain a certain kind of meditation that is very important for everything that follows. The Tree of Duality, this elaborates on the story of the Garden of Eden as contained within the book of Genesis. I give my interpretation of that and explain its relevance to the subject of duality. Chapter 4, Matter, of course, that deals with the material realm that we all find ourselves in. Mortal life and suffering, this addresses the so-called problem of suffering. If God is good and if He's all powerful, how can there be so much suffering in the world? And the simple answer is that one thing that is missed in when people think of these things is that God might have a very good reason for allowing it. Counterfeit spirituality, this is something I've talked about a lot. This concerns, in the case of material counterfeit spirituality, it concerns, I talk about hallucinogens, I talk about souls whose spirituality is centered around worldly things like nationality, for example. Renouncement, that's a very important section as well. That deals with both outer renouncement and inner renouncement. Outer renouncement being, becoming a recluse. Inner renouncement being the true renouncement, becoming disentangled from the things of the world, for example. Reincarnation and karma, that very much speaks for itself. Chapter 5, Mind, I explain why the mind is deficient. I explain how heaven and hell are states of mind before they're anything else. I talk about, so there I speak about hallucinogens. So what is yes. Here I explain idolatry, the proper meaning of idolatry. Here I explain dreams and hallucinogens and why I don't recommend focusing on either very strongly. Harnessing the mind, that is how to coexist with your mind and to not allow it to be detrimental to your experience of reality. Chapter 6, Religion, by far the biggest chapter. When I was writing the book, I did my best to ensure that every chapter was roughly the same size, but with the heavier chapters being towards the second half of the book. But that religion chapter is certainly the biggest chapter. The function of religion, in there I explain how religion comes about and why it inevitably becomes a problem, why it inevitably will fail to meet the spiritual needs of souls. And I talk a little bit about my time as a religionist myself. Crucifixion and resurrection, this explains the symbology and the meaning of the crucifixion and resurrection as contained within the gospel narratives. Sacred text, that talks about scripture essentially, what scripture is, the difference between inspiration and dictation. I talk about the way the New Testament texts were developed and why understanding them to be infallible just isn't sustainable. Biblical prophecy, well, that speaks for itself. I deal with the prophecy of the Bible. I also talk about Nostradamus in there because I think he's responsible for the way that prophecy is misunderstood in the modern day to a very large degree. So there's 12 chapters in the book. I've just gone through the first 6. And the way I divided the book is that the first 6 are kind of things that are talked about by many souls, whereas the next 6 that follow, the second half of the book, we really get into the depths of mysticism then, beginning with the subject of silence, the mystery of silence, something that almost no one talks about. But I talk about the mystery of silence. I do my best to explain why silence is such an important thing and why it's so present in the history of mystic thought and yet something that isn't talked about much. I talked about how it relates to the way we understand ourselves, how we project ourselves in the world, and I talk about a purpose, specifically the fact that we are to surrender our purpose to God. And in surrendering our own intent to God, we begin to live out God's intent for our life. Honestly, I'm not doing these sections justice in my summary here. I'm just trying to tell you the kind of things I talk about in each section. Again, bearing in mind the book is 90,000, over 90,000 words long. That's 250 pages. Chapter 8, Adjustment. You see, this has all been systematically written. This is why it wasn't just that I was writing a book dealing with life's biggest questions. It was that I wanted the book to systematically guide the reader into a direct experience of the spiritual. So the order that I've done everything in is very deliberate. And the two prior versions of this book that I wrote, when I'd finished writing them, I looked at them and I thought, this isn't quite as effective as I wanted it to be. But the order here is very deliberate. So after introducing the reader to the subject of silence in chapter 7, which is the most major threshold to cross in terms of spirituality, I immediately talk about adjustment. In other words, adjusting to the new state of being and the effects that it has on your life. So here I talk about the sifting, which is something from the Gospel of Luke, which is a phenomenon that many souls will be familiar with, if not by that name. Why has that created that there? I don't know. Then blinding expectations. That is to do with the way that before we embark upon the spiritual path, we have all kinds of expectations about what that the spiritual path is going to give us. And I explain how those expectations can actually blind you to the subtle realities of spiritual life. Detachment and alienation. That, as the name suggests, that relates to the fact that as you continue on in the spiritual journey, you'll begin to feel more detached from those about you, and you'll begin to feel alienated. And I explain how that's a natural process and is ultimately a positive thing. Ideological opposition. This deals with those who oppose the mystic message, as it were. Those who have certain arguments against the mystic message, and it really talks about the best way to approach such opposition. Chapter 9, Virtue. This deals with morality essentially. I begin by explaining why I don't. Those of you who watched me for any length of time, you'll know that I don't go into morality at all. I just don't deal in morality, and that explains why. Essentially because moral absolutes will inevitably fail. There's always going to be a scenario or a situation, even if it's purely hypothetical, where any moral absolute, most moral absolutes are going to fall down. And so I explain what the alternative is. A true faith, I explain the meaning of faith, what faith actually is. I talk about prayer here. I talk about the true meaning of love, namely that it's not simply an emotion but an act. And in explaining that, I strive to illuminate all kinds of different areas. Chapter 10, Aether. Now this is the one, if someone interested in spirituality is going to look at that table of contents, they'll recognize almost everything there, but Aether is something they won't recognize. But Aether is my term for a substance that others would call ghostly or astral. And so this is where, I mean, all throughout this book, I'm giving testimonies of my own direct experience of these things. And that's why I said earlier that I think when my family reads it, they're going to be very surprised and perhaps quite shocked. But there's no greater an example of that than what I talk about in chapter 10, Aether, because I'm talking about essentially ghosts and ghostly realms. I talk about angels and demons and things like that. So I talk about the nature of Aether, just to be clear about what I'm talking about exactly. Artificial afterlives, I'm talking about ethereal realms, whether heavenly or hellish. Ethereal beings, this is where I talk about ghosts, I talk about angels, demons, what they are exactly. I recount that story that I shared, was it last week or the week before, of seeing that cat-like puma when I was wandering across the countryside. Ethereal Evil talks specifically about how to deal with an ethereal encounter, even in the context of the dream world, The reason being that the dream world often robs you of your faculties, but there's a way to get around that. And so I talk about an experience of being persecuted in the dream world and how I eventually overcame that. I mean, to the secular mind, this is far out stuff. This book is very far out. There's no doubt about that. There was no half measures here. Chapter 11, Spirit. Well, talks about God, the divine attributes, creation, and Yeshua, of course. This just gives an overview of Yeshua. I can't really say much about these things. It really speaks for itself, but this is one of the largest chapters. See, I can't start talking about it because if I start explaining one thing, I'll have to explain another thing, and then I'll just be relating the content of the book over a 4-hour video. Chapter 12, Oneness. See, having established all of these things, especially the unity of all creation in chapter 11, in chapter 12, I called it Oneness because I'm really explaining things that can only be understood once you understand how and why all of creation is united. So I begin with free will and destiny. I talk about divination, and this section actually, it seems kind of random because there I start talking about different methods of divination, the I Ching, the tarot, all kinds of things. I go into quite a bit of depth on the tarot, but I pull it back to the understandings that I've established previously, and I conclude by saying that the important thing about these systems of divination is not that they do work, it's the reason that they work, and that's the important thing to focus on. And then overcoming the world and rest are not something that you can really understand until you've read the rest of the book. So that's just a very, very brief overview. I did a horrible injustice, but I talk about just about everything in this book, and that was, of course, intentional. Now you may wonder, well, if this book is so definitive, which it was always intended to be, then why are you writing 2 more books after that? And the reason is very simple. You see, the subtitle of this book is very deliberate. It's called The Mystic Answer to Everything. This first book takes a very cognitive approach to the subject matter because throughout the book I'm elaborating upon history, I'm elaborating upon sacred texts, theology and so forth. So it's a very cognitive approach. I thought that would be the best approach to take with the first book because it essentially lays the intellectual framework for everything that follows. But the fact is that not every soul resonates with such an approach. And so the next book in the series, that will be more human, because I think a lot of you who watch my videos might be surprised by the tone of this book and the way it's written. In the same way, if someone were to read this book without seeing me here, they're going to come to this live stream expecting some very dour, serious guy, because the tone of this book is deliberately serious and deliberately archaic. There's almost no humor in this book at all. Very serious, very straightforward. So the next book in the series is going to appeal to a soul in a different place. And so while the book will still be about experiential spirituality, I won't be evoking all these high-minded affairs. I won't be elaborating upon history and sacred texts. It'll be a very soul-to-soul interaction, a very personal, a very intimate approach, because that is something that resonates with different kinds of souls. By the same token, the third book, while still about experiential spirituality, that is going to explain experiential spirituality in light of modern technology, in light of pop culture and so forth, and I do intend that book to be more humorous. So that's why each book in this series is definitive in its own right. It just depends what kind of soul you are and what kind of approach you resonate more with. If you're someone like someone who watches this channel, for example, you're probably going to like the more cognitive approach of this book, but others will like the more gentle, intimate approach of the second book, and so on. So that's the reason for that. Now, I'm going to read the preface here. Ever wondered what the difference between a preface and an introduction and a foreword is? Well, I've just forgotten. Now, a preface is when you are explaining why you wrote the book that you did. An introduction is when you're introducing the content of the book. There's a subtle difference there. A foreword is an introduction or a preface, but written by someone other than the author. And then, of course, a prologue is something that belongs to fiction writing as opposed to non-fiction. So there are subtle differences between what a preface is, what an introduction is, and what a foreword is. This is a preface, and I'm going to read to you the preface and explain my thought process as I was going, because this preface was a late addition. As I said, when it comes to books, I've always been someone that only really cared what was at the heart of the book, what was between chapter 1 and the last chapter. I read everything outside of that, but I want everything in a book to be within the chapters themselves. So my whole book was written without any kind of introduction or preface whatsoever. So that preface was the last thing I wrote. And the reason I wrote it is because I was deliberately archaic in my approach with this book. In the book, I don't mention modern technology at all. I don't refer to contemporary things. I deliberately wrote the book in a very timeless way, so that if someone reads it 10 years from now, it won't appear aged, because I didn't start talking about social media sites and things like that. I did that on purpose. But the problem with doing that is that I always wanted to connect the experiential spirituality books with this experiential spirituality live streams. So I couldn't mention these live streams in the main body of the book because I don't mention modern technology in the book, essentially. So I'll explain to you the logic of what I said in this preface and why I said it. So I begin on a cheery note. You will die one day, and on that day you will be faced with spiritual realities that you know nothing about. Why did I begin that way? Okay, this is a thing with me, and it's that I'm used to discussing these subjects with other souls. I'm used to getting into debates on these subjects with other souls. And so in many cases, when I'm writing about a certain subject, what I've got in my head is the last time I argued with someone on this subject, the things they said to me and so forth. So the first thing you have to do is living in a very secular place, I know that I have to make readers care straight away. Why is this book relevant? And so I just start off the bat saying, look, you're going to die one day, and you're going to have to face spiritual realities you know nothing about. And that's what this book is about. So yeah, it's just a way to get people's attention straight away, essentially. I often find myself having to remind souls of that fact, for many suppose that spiritual matters are not something that will ever concern them. You see, again, this is very context sensitive, I think. Like, if you're in the United States, maybe that's not going to be the case where you are. Maybe you live in the Bible Belt where people are really concerned with spiritual matters. But I live in Scotland, which is a very secular country, and I know exactly how people around here, for example, would read this book, how they're going to receive this book. They're going to think, who's this weirdo who's written this weird book? And that's why my approach from the beginning is kind of combative. I'm getting their attention straight away, and I'm making clear that no, you're not going to be demeaning, and you're not going to approach this book in a patronizing fashion. You're going to pay attention to what is written here because it's going to be relevant to you. It is easy for them to believe that in times of comfort, but there will come a point when even the most cynical materialist will find themselves wondering if there really is something beyond the mundane world that they took to be the whole of reality. What often follows for such souls is the terrible realization that they have spent their lives refusing to seriously engage with the great spiritual questions, and that it is now far too late to begin doing so, which is true. Those great spiritual questions have been at the forefront of my mind since I was a child, and from the earliest age I would read as many books on the subject of spirituality as I could. Most of them had a very narrow scope and did not address many issues, but no matter how broad their scope was, all that such books presented was a series of explanations that readers were expected to accept for little to no reason. Even in my youth, I intuitively knew that there was something deeply wrong with such an approach and expectation. What I could never have known is that God would one day reveal himself. Okay, I'll stop there. So, the reason I wrote that is because, of course, there's no shortage of books on spirituality out there in the world. So what I'm doing in that passage is making clear to the reader that I'm conscious of that fact, that I'm conscious that the spiritual book market is gigantic and that there's 1,000 other books they could buy. I'm setting my book apart immediately. I'm saying, look, I understand that all these other books on spirituality, what they do is they essentially make assertions about the nature of reality that they expect you to accept. And since I'm acknowledging that criticism, I'm essentially telling the reader that this book is not going to be that. So I go on to say, what I could never have known is that God would one day reveal himself to me, and that it was ultimately my destiny to help reawaken souls to the reality of the spiritual by helping them to understand the meaning and significance of mystic wisdom. So again, having in mind the people like in my family and the people that live in this country, I know exactly how that statement is going to sound to them. See, the circles I'm used to, it's nothing for someone to talk about God and their destiny and things like that, but I know how someone from a secular country is going to take that. So I immediately address that issue. I say, of course, I am perfectly well aware of how that latter statement sounds to most souls in the Western world, even many that themselves profess some manner of spiritual belief. It is just not acceptable to use words like God and destiny in so much polite company these days, except perhaps as a punchline. The one that uses such terminology without irony should fully expect to be mocked and to be regarded as very odd. So I'm demonstrating self-awareness here. I'm saying to the reader, look, I know exactly how that sounds to a great many of you. But then again, I go back to being combative and I seek to correct them immediately, because I say, but the fact is that if you are uncomfortable with a soul talking in such ways, then it is you that are the aberration. You are the conditioned product of an extremely young secular society, a society that will ultimately prove to be a blip within the span of human history. If you are at all concerned with truth, then you should entertain the idea that your very modern perspective might be blinding you to greater realities. Essentially saying to the reader, yeah, I know what many of you think, I know how weird many of you think this is, but that's only because you're trapped in a bubble, essentially. You've got a skewed perspective on things because your perspective of reality isn't wide enough. The fact is that across the course of human history, you're the one that's the aberration. It's normal to speak about God and destiny and things of that nature. So one may question the wisdom of being so combative with the reader from the very beginning, but I felt that was necessary because it gets them to pay attention. Just like in so many other contexts, sometimes it's important to be a little bit aggressive so that you get their attention and you make clear that you're not there to be patronized, that this is something to be taken seriously and it's something that they should take seriously. The mystic message has only ever been for those souls with enough humility to receive it, and it is to the end of making mystic truth known that I have elaborated upon spiritual matters for many years now, both in person and more recently in a weekly live stream that is also called Experiential Spirituality. Yet it is not merely that I have a message to share, it is that I myself am that message in the same way that every mystic that ever lived has personified the truth that they taught. In other words, this is not just about having a philosophy and handing it out to people. This is something that needs to be lived. And so what I'm trying to do is make clear to the reader that this is not going to be, the reading of this book is not going to be something to be taken lightly. This is not something that is intended to be just read and then forgotten about. This is something that is intended to be absorbed, because mystics, they embody the truths they speak of. And so, yeah, that's why I said that. To bring spiritual understanding and to alleviate suffering through that understanding is the very purpose of my life and the sole reason that I exist in the world. Again, very dramatic statements. This first book represents a major fulfillment within that purpose, for the more that I have interacted with other souls on the subject of spirituality, the more that I have come to see the need for such books. Different mediums have different advantages, and the advantage of writing a book is that I can expound upon every relevant subject to whatever extent I deem necessary and reasonable. Therefore, making the best use of the opportunity, I have addressed as wide a range of issues as possible, yet in a measured way so as not to overwhelm. That's just to let souls know that the book it deals with complicated subject matter, but I've tried to make it as accessible as possible. This book will answer all of the great spiritual questions, either directly or indirectly, but more importantly, It will explain the means by which you may recognize your relationship with the spiritual, and in doing so, transform your understanding and experience of reality. I have very much written the book that I would have dearly loved to have stumbled upon decades ago. May it prove as invaluable to you as it would have to me. So that's the preface, and I think the point is made in that preface. I think I'll have the reader's attention by the end of that preface. Again, when I wrote that preface, most souls who read this book, they're going to have an interest in the spiritual anyway, and they want to read another book about spirituality. That preface is really for the kind of secular individuals that I'm more used to dealing with, those who think it's just weird to talk about God or destiny or spirituality at all. So that was really to get them on side, as it were, and to explain what distinguishes this book from the thousands of others that you can potentially read. But yeah, it's a strange feeling to have this book done finally, and it's very strange not to have it in my life. As I said, I woke up the other day and the first thing I thought was, got to get working on the book. And then I realised, nope, the book is done. It's no longer a part of my life, and I'm this book is everything that I wanted it to be, quite simply. And I knew it was worth the 3 years that I spent working on it. I don't know if 3 years worth of hard graft can ever really be conveyed in a book. You know, if someone picks this book up without ever having watched any of these live streams, they'll probably just read it and think, oh, there's a book. I don't think that amount of effort can ever come across in a book, but I know, because I wrote earlier versions, I know that effort was worth it. And I know that this book is special, but I don't know how even you guys who watch this channel will respond to it. I really honestly have no idea. But what I can say is that this is as good as I can make it, and I'm very happy with the result. It is everything that I wanted it to be. So I think that's all I'll say on that subject. And what I'm going to do is not do a live stream next week, because the book is done now. I need to put it out there and leave it to do what it's going to do. And in my personal life, I need to go outside and sit in the sunshine. I need to clean this place up a bit, because in the last 3 months, trying to get this book finally prepared for release, I've neglected such things, and I really need to go outside and sit in the sun somewhere. I'm not joking. So, Nicholas says, I unfortunately can't stick around for the stream today, but I wish everyone a good afternoon. Tate says, hello David, and also in the chat, hello Tate. You're almost always the first one in this chat. Greta says, I always had faith in you, and now I'm so excited to see the finished project. Well, thank you. I hope it's good. I'm always it's difficult to trust someone else with your book, because for all I know, someone's going to get a weird copy of it or something like that. But as you can see, the book, as it's meant to be, is perfect in the way that it manifests. So hopefully everyone's copy will be fine, just like that. Kimosabe says, greetings. Tate says, congratulations on the book release. I'll be purchasing a copy shortly. Thank you. I hope you enjoy it. I'm really, really curious what you guys are going to make of it, because I'm positive, again, even if you've watched my YouTube channel, like all my YouTube channels across the last 15 years, I'm positive this book is not going to be what you think it is. It's about what you think it is, but I'm positive the manner of the book won't be what you think it is. Daniel Merritt X said, great work, I've got myself a copy just now on Kindle. Will give it a read, although I'm a slow reader. I like to savor each book I read. Well, thank you, Daniel, and that is the correct approach to take with this book. I don't think it's a book that can be read quickly at all. And Eurocraft says, there's a shortage of perfect books in this world. It would be a pity to damage yours. That's a Princess Bride quote there. Just don't mind. Nice username. Divine Focus equals morning coffee. Only joking. Book sounds very interesting. A philosophical approach to religious ideas and practices? I wouldn't say so, no, because that horrible temptation for me to read parts of the book is arising again, which I must not do now that it's available. But no, it actually more explains why philosophy and things within the realm of the mind are not that important. It's more about, as the title suggests, one's direct experience of the spiritual and verifying mystic truths through that experience. Greta says, I'm looking forward to getting to grips with this book. It has come at a good time for me and I'm thankful. Well, thank you, Greta. I really genuinely hope this book is useful to everyone who reads it. Again, I try to address as much as possible, but again, the tone of this book is very cold. There's almost no humour in this book. I write in a very archaic fashion, very matter-of-fact and straight to the point, simply because I had to, because there's so much subject matter here that I can't take time to tell funny little anecdotes. I don't have the time to do anything other than focus on the subject at hand. Bugsy Malone said, hello, I've just arrived now, so I'm going back to the start. If anyone needs me, I will be alive and well and living around half an hour in all of your pasts. Neurocraft says, none of those should be confused with a preamble. And you know what, I'll be honest, I don't know what a preamble is. I mean, I've heard of it, obviously, but I'm not actually sure what the distinction between a preamble, a foreword, an introduction, and a preface is. But I'm sure I did, actually. Let me see. I'll find out now, because that's going to bother me. A preliminary or preparatory statement, an introduction. Okay, it's just let's just say it's a form of introduction then. I think a preamble would be for maybe a presentation, perhaps. So, again, I'm going to not do a live stream next week while I get used to my new life that doesn't involve waking up every single day and working on this book for 6 hours. Going to get some sunshine, going to let the book do what it's going to do out there in the world. And for those of you who buy a copy, first of all, thank you. And again, please do leave at least a short review on Amazon because it really does help. And I genuinely hope this book is everything you hope that it is. It's everything I wanted it to be. There's nothing more I could add to this book in terms of content to make it any more sufficient for what I wanted it to achieve. But I honestly have no idea what those reading it are going to make of it. I honestly have no idea at all. But whatever happens to this book now that it's out there, it's not going to make a difference to the two that follow it. Like, if everyone hates this book, for example, let's say everyone hated this book, or if only 2 souls read the book, even if that happened, I would still write the next and the 3rd book. I would still write this trilogy because I'm just doing what God is directing me to do, as simple as that. And so everything else is irrelevant. Or to put it in more Eastern terms, I'm not attached to the outcome of my actions. I just do my actions and I'm not concerned with what follows from there. But on a personal level, I am very hopeful that you will enjoy the book and that you'll get something out of it. Honestly, I can't imagine anyone reading this book and not learning something from it. I just can't imagine it because I just cover so much. As for weaknesses, can I see weaknesses in my own book? Well, I think that some might call it a bit humorless because it is. Apart from, I think there's 2 little jokes I make in the book. Overall, it's pretty humorless, though it's pretty serious and straightforward. That's the nature of the beast. Another issue is because this is a definitive book about the spiritual, and I covered so much subject matter, it necessarily meant that I couldn't go into as much depth on many subjects as I could have, and I didn't simply because I didn't feel the need to. So someone might look at this book and look at what I say about a certain subject and say, I wish he'd gone into a bit more depth on that subject. So that could happen as well. But again, the book is everything that it was meant to be. Neurocraft says, after 2 weeks of sun, next live stream, Bronzed Mystic. In theory, I said that I should go out and sit in the sunshine, but let me ask you something, fellow internet denizens. Is it more likely that I'll go out and sit in the sunshine, or is it more likely that I'll just sit here listening to Red Letter Media movie commentaries? Place your bets now, but I'm fairly confident of the answer. At least I can listen to Red Letter Media movie commentaries while I'm cleaning this place, which it certainly needs to be cleaned. But again, thank you so much, everyone, for not just being here today, but for all of your, for your presence over the last 3 years. Because it's really helped to take me to where I am now, which is finally this book is out there. And again, I've got to now reorientate myself to the fact that the book is done, because it's been such a huge part of my life for so long that it seems, and now I've got, never mind, it just seems strange to not have it. So Tate says, thank you, David, and everybody in the chat. I hope you enjoy your time off in the sunshine. Thank you, everyone, and may your moment be mystical.